Hello, and welcome to Eastern Roman History, the 1000 subscriber special. I am your host, Daniel Maynard, and today we will be talking about the topic of Justinian the Great's Western conquests and their legacy. We'll be discussing his motivations for his westward expansion, an overview of the campaigns in Africa, Italy, and Spain, and lastly, the long-term consequences of these reconquests, asking ourselves, were they a success? To get the ball rolling, I would like to read this passage from Timothy Gregory's A History of Byzantium to give us an academic breakdown of the nature of Justinian the Great's campaigns. Timothy Gregory, A History of Byzantium, 306 to 1453, page 142 to 145. As mentioned at the outset, it is difficult to know how to evaluate the reign of Justinian. On the one hand, this period can be seen as the great flowering of the culture and political power of early Byzantine civilization. On the other, it can be viewed as an age of tyranny and fiscal excess that laid the seeds for collapse in the decades to come. Probably, these are just two sides of the same issue. The age of Justinian was, in many ways, the fulfillment of the religious, political, and cultural trends that began in the age of Constantine, 200 years earlier. The emperor was supremely confident in his relationship to God and his God-given right to rule the world. Many of his predecessors had felt the same way, but Justinian had the talent and the hyperactive personality to attempt to put the political theories of Byzantium into effect. He was undoubtedly intelligent and single-minded in his desire to defeat his enemies and accomplish his goals. In some of these accomplishments, he was brilliantly successful, at least in the short run, and the degree of cultural activity in his time is remarkable by any standard. Naturally, a crucial aspect of any evaluation of the reign of Justinian is the political and military collapse that took place in the empire almost immediately after his death. We will talk about these events in the pages that follow. But in general terms, we have to ask whether we should blame these problems on the expensive, grandiose, and mistaken policies of Justinian, or whether we should find their causes in the actions of his predecessors, of his successors. Certainly, our own ambivalence about the reign of Justinian comes also from the works of Procopius, a predominant author for this period, and through whose work we, by necessity, view the emperor. Procopius of Caesarea was a contemporary of Justinian, and, as secretary to Belisarius, he had first-hand information about many of the events, particularly the military campaigns that he describes. The historian's three main works present three almost completely opposed views of the emperor and his age. The Wars is an epic depiction of the wars of the period, written in a highly classicizing style that consciously imitates the ancient historian Thucydides. In this work, the emperor does not figure highly, as the main characters are the soldiers and generals engaged in Justinian's attempt at reconquest. The Buildings clearly is a work of flattery, written to praise the emperor as a great builder, whose wisdom and close connection to God assure his every success and allow him to surpass all his predecessors. The Secret History, on the other hand, is a work of calumny, full of personal attacks on the emperor, but even more on Theodora and her friend Antonia, the wife of Belisarius. Much of the book is scandalous and humorous to the modern reader, and the decidedly pornographic depictions of Theodora, notably before she became empress, have won the book both praise and condemnation. Certainly, the secret history is not a balanced account, any more than the buildings is, and many of the details can hardly be accepted as historical truth, interesting as they are. So, what motivated Justinian's conquests? To this end, I shall go through each province, Africa, Italy, and Spain, and talk about the motivations for, the sketch of the history of the conquests, and then finally a little bit about the settlement of them after they had been conquered. First of all, Africa. Justinian the Great was not the first emperor to try and dislodge the Vandals, nor was he the second. In fact, he was the fourth emperor to consider conquering the Vandals, since they first appeared in Africa. In 441 AD, Theodosius II sent an expedition to defeat the Vandals, which had just captured Carthage. Due to differing in Sicily, they had to be recalled to meet the more immediate Hunnic and Persian threat. You can see Prosper of Aquitaine's Chronicle 440 to 441 for a better account. In 460, the Western Roman Emperor Majorian had attempted to defeat the Vandals, but failed because his fleet was betrayed and destroyed while still in anchor. See Hydatius' Chronicle, year 460, page 195, alternatively 200. In 468, Leo I the Great organised a massive force to conquer the Vandals and remove this barbarian threat from the rear of the Roman world. 1,113 ships and 100,000 men were sent against Gaiseric by Leo, and with some contributions by the Western Emperor Anthemius. It was a total disaster, and its memory haunted the Eastern Roman Empire for several decades to come. See Priscus's fragmentary history for more. It is thus unsurprising that Justinian, with lots of money and troops, as well as peace on all frontiers, wanted to try and retake Africa in 533. He certainly had the opportunity to do so. One can also ascribe one of his motivations for attacking Africa to opportunism. In fact, all three of his conquests occurred at opportune moments, where the own barbarian kingdom was weak, and Justinian was in a stronger position and hoped to exploit it. Justinian's immediate casus belli against the Vandals was due to the successful rebellion of Gillimer against King Hilderic, king of the Vandals. Justinian asked the king of the Ostrogoths to not receive embassies from Gelimer as a way to try and diplomatically isolate the Vandals. Justinian, whether by design or not, seized the opportunity to retake one of the most vital parts of the now deceased Western Roman Empire. See John Malalas, chapter 18, part 57. Justinian could justly invade the Vandal kingdom to destroy the tyrant Gelimer. The Romans were at peace with both Persia and the Danube, as I have said. So, Naturally, this was the best time for an attack against the West. There is also the element of revanchism. The Vandals were Arians and had persecuted the Catholic population in Africa. A full account of these persecutions is given in the history of Victor of Vita on the Catholic persecution. In addition, most of the population of Africa were Roman citizens. They had been oppressed by the Vandals, and several areas had rebelled. In the immediate run-up to Justinian's attack, Tripoli and Sardinia rebelled against Gelimer, both led by Romans that wanted to secede back to Roman authority. Certainly, in the propaganda of Justinian, a desire for the new Rome to own the territories of the old was one of his justifications for invading Africa. Africa was also the wealthiest province of the old Western Roman Empire, as I have said. And even if Justinian effected this conquest alone, it would be a huge boon for the Eastern Roman Empire. It would also put to rest the spectre of piracy that the Vandals had practiced until Leo I's Treaty of Geiserik in 470. The chance of it happening again was not unrealistic. When Belisarius invaded, he specifically instructed his men not to pillage any villages or loot conquered towns, since they had come as liberators, not as invaders. This kind of attitude lends itself to the idea that these were reconquests and not invasions. Moving on to the specifics of the war, at the Battle of Ad Decimum on the 13th of September 533, Belisarius, leading the Roman armies, decisively defeated the Vandals, although it had nearly resulted in a total disaster for the Romans. Victory was snatched only because of the quick thinking and prowess of Belisarius, the inexperience of Gelimer, and, as is always the case in such battles, a bit of luck. This was soon followed up by the recapture of Carthage the following day, and a second decisive defeat of Gelimer on the 15th of December 533 at the Battle of Tricamarum. Gelimer was besieged with the remains of his ragtag force of Vandals on Mount Papua. In March 534, Gelimer surrendered. He was given an estate in Galatia, but was denied the honour of patrician because Gelimer refused to renounce his Arian faith. Quickly, after the defeat of Gelimer at Tricamarum, the Romans managed to reconquer most of Africa very quickly. Sardinia, Corsica, and the Balearic Islands soon fell as well. Mauritania was retaken up to Septem in Tingitana, as well as the Strait of Gibraltar. All Arian churches were restored to Catholic clergy. Vandals were barred from public offices. The states owned by Vandals were restored to the descendants of them. Sorry about that, my streaming software momentarily disconnected. Where was I? An army of Africa was established based on the comitatenses that had been sent with Belisarius, the Foederati, and the native Romano-Africans that formed the comitatenses and limitani of the army of Africa. 5 new cavalry regiments were created from the Vandal population and were stationed on the Persian frontier, known thereafter as the Vandali Justiniani. A number A number of Vandals also entered the private service of Belisarius as his retainers. The rough total of these Vandals that joined the Roman armed forces was about 3,000. See Procopius, Book 4, Chapter 14, line 17. The rest of the Vandal army was enslaved, and their wives were married off to Romans. The result of all of these measures was the extinction of the Vandal kingdom. Africa was heavily fortified by its governor Solomon. On and off conflicts continued with the Moors and rebellions by both Vandals and Romans against Roman rule. For example, in 536, 2/3 of the army of Africa mutinied. The conflict was interspersed with periods of peace, but it was not until 552 that peace was more permanently established in the province. Now on to Italy. Once again, one of the motivations for Justinian's invasion of this province was opportunism. Recent instability in the Ostrogothic monarchy presented Justinian with a new opportunity to exploit their weakness. The death of Theodoric the Great in 526 meant that his grandson Athalaric became king, with his mother Amalasuntha as regent. The regency of her mother brought her into conflict with the Gothic nobility, especially as Amalasuntha pursued measures that protected the Romano-Italians against their Gothic overlords. She was also in close contact with the court of Constantinople. There is also the element of revanchism, which explains why Justinian's desire to retake territory, specifically Italy, was in mind. Also, it is believed that John the Cappadocian gave the advice to Justinian that Africa could not be taken without the conquest of Sicily and Italy as well. The significance of Italy as being the origin of the Roman Empire and Rome itself also must have motivated Justinian to act. King Athalaric himself fell ill and died in 534, just as his war in Africa was coming to a close. Athalaric died because of an illness brought on by his drunkenness and his excessive vice. Amalasuntha became queen regnant in 534 after the death of her son, and married Theodahad. In 535, Theodahad, imprisoned and, perhaps even with the connivance of the Empress Theodora, assassinated Amalasuntha, who was by now very unpopular with the Gothic nobility. It is at this junction that Justinian decided to invade. Justinian had also covertly planned the invasion of Italy, and in 535 sent armies against Ostrogothic Dalmatia, led by Mundus, and Sicily, led by Belisarius. These were targeted first to seize the maritime accesses to Italy. The army sent to Sicily was officially supposed to head to Africa, so as not to alarm the Ostrogoths. This was done because Justinian wanted to be sure that he could capture Sicily and Italy without too much of a fight. If Belisarius, who led the forces to Sicily, saw there were too many soldiers and fortifications, My OBS studio is disconnected again. Justinian attempted to get the Franks to invade Italy from the north, as two Nicene Christian kingdoms against an Arian one. However, the Franks promised help, but they were divided between three factions, meaning that help from them was almost certainly not forthcoming. Finding no strong force on Sicily, Belisarius captured the whole island by the end of December 535, with only major resistance at Panormus. Sicily seems to have largely been pro-Roman, and so only the Ostrogothic garrisons gave resistance. The Romans were glad to be rid of them. Theodahad, at losing both Dalmatia and Sicily, capitulated. The terms he was given were as follows. The Ostrogoths sent £300 of gold per year. They would send 300 Gothic foederati to the Roman army, guarantee the lives of property of Roman senators and clerics in their land, unless permission was granted by the emperor. Theodahad also had to ask the emperor to confer patrician or senatorial ranks on someone first, thus meaning he could not act independently. That the emperor's name was to be acclaimed before his in the circus or theatre, and to ensure that any statue erected to the king of the Ostrogoths also had to have the emperor's set up next to it. Effectively, this was to reduce the Ostrogothic kingdom to a vassal state. This proposal was rejected, however, and so Theodahad consented to handing over Italy to Justinian, and a province that produced, in exchange for being given a province that would produce £120 of gold per year, and these lands should be entrusted to Theodahad. The most likely target was Tuscany. However, recent skirmishes in Dalmatia had changed circumstances. The Goths had killed in battle Mundus and his son Maurice, who led the army there, despite having crushed the Gothic counterattack. At this news, Theodahad changed his mind and had the Roman envoys arrested. Constantine was sent to Dalmatia with reinforcements, and within 3 months, by June 536, had captured the entire province from the Goths, who abandoned their position and returned to Italy. Belisarius was commanded to invade Italy, and thus the Ostrogothic War had begun in earnest. Belisarius captured Naples in 536. Theodahad's inaction and paralysis at the invasion caused the Goths to elect Vitiges as king. Theodahad was murdered on his retreat to Ravenna by Optaris, who was sent by Vitiges to murder Theodahad. By the end of 536, Belisarius had occupied Campania on his march to Rome. In 537, he captured and then had to defend Rome itself in 538. As well as in that year, and defeating the Ostrogothic attack on Rome, Ariminum was relieved, and John the Armenian's forces were saved after they had gotten themselves trapped in the city by the Goths. In 539, Milan, which had been retaken in 538, was besieged, and, due to the politics of the Roman army's high command, delayed too long to act. Milan's garrison was taken captive, and 300,000 people were slaughtered. The women were enslaved to the Burgundians, and the city was razed to the ground. However, Belisarius did succeed in taking Orsimenum by November 539. The Goths Now on the brink of defeat, now had the Franks tried to interfere with the Roman conquests, intending to take advantage of the events in Italy. Justinian offered terms. His terms were that Vitiges should have dominion over everything north of the Po River, and the Romans everything south of it. Vitiges accepted it, but Belisarius himself took issue with the terms. He had spent 5 years fighting, and, with victory within his grasp, he was too proud and stubborn to come to terms as equals now. Belisarius' refusal to ratify the treaty encouraged Vitiges to suspect the treaty itself, and decided to only sign it if Belisarius did. The Gothic nobility, fed up with Vitiges' incompetence and failure, and sensing that Belisarius would be far better of a ruler of Italy, proposed to make him Western Roman Emperor. Belisarius entertained this idea, not from an ambition for power, for he was an honourable man, but to bring the war to a speedy end. His intention was to go along with the Gothic idea of making him emperor, only to disappoint them at the last moment, yet seize all of their lands. In May 540, Belisarius marched into Ravenna to accept the surrender of the Ostrogoths. Vitiges was taken prisoner. The Gothic nobility were unmolested, and refugees returned. The Gothic treasury was seized, and the capital of Italy was once again retaken by the Roman Empire. Soon after, the Ostrogothic garrisons in northern Italy surrendered as well. The remaining Gothic resistance proclaimed Ildibad, king of the Ostrogoths. Although Belisarius had achieved peace by disobeying the Emperor Justinian and deceiving the Ostrogoths, who fully expected Belisarius to become emperor, he had, by overstepping his bounds, conquered most of Italy. But he fatally left the job half done, and had not completely eradicated the Ostrogoths. Belisarius sailed back to Constantinople, and, as just reward, Justinian did not give him a second triumph. This is perhaps understandable, considering that Belisarius had committed mutiny. A blunderous policy of Justinian was not to appoint a new commander-in-chief of Italy after Belisarius left. This allowed the generals to be equals, which resulted in a lack of cooperation and a proliferation of self-interests. Discipline collapsed in all quarters, and the Italians suffered as a result. The Roman generals did virtually nothing to prevent the Goths from breaking out of their base at Ticinum. Fortunately, at this moment, there were problems in the Ostrogothic court as well. Ildibad, after his queen was insulted by a man called Uraeus' wife, had Uraeus executed. Since Uraeus had put Ildibad on the throne in the first place, his confederates were not the best pleased. A Gepid bodyguard, with an axe to grind, murdered Ildibad to get revenge for his private grudge in 541. The Rugians in the Alps, who were the Goths' subjects, proclaimed their own man, Eraric, king. The Ostrogoths wanted to obtain the peace Justinian had offered, dividing Italy along the Po River. Eraric betrayed them, and asked Justinian for the rank of patrician and a fortune of money in exchange for rule over northern Italy. The Goths, unhappy with Eraric's pacifism, proclaimed Totila their king and assassinated Eraric. In 542, the Roman commanders' lack of leadership and infighting led to debacle after debacle. At the Battle of Lemone, Totila and 5,000 Goths scored a crushing defeat against the Roman army, commanded by Alexander and Constantine, numbering about 12,000 men. By 544, the Romans had been thrown back all the way to Naples, which fell to the Goths in March or April 543. In spring 544, Belisarius was finally recalled to sort out Italy. The next 5 years were spent in dogged fighting with the Goths. Germanus, the cousin of Justinian, prepared an expedition to Italy and married Matasuntha, the sister of Athalaric and granddaughter of Theodoric the Great. As Germanus was heir presumptive, Matasuntha would become empress when he became emperor, which tore the Goths' loyalties to Totila. Could they fight their future? Could they fight against the line of Theodoric? Or back the man with fewer claims to power, Totila? However, Germanus's grand expedition, which all but guaranteed immediate success, never happened, as the poor man died of a sickness in the autumn of 550. In 551, Theodebert, king of the Franks, invaded Italy. They conquered the Cottian Alps, Liguria, and inland Venetia. In 552, Narses, with Lombard allies, attacked Italy and scored a triumphal victory against Totila at the Battle of Busta Gallorum. Totila fled the battle, but was killed by the Gepid leader Asbad. Narses dismissed the Lombards as they started to pillage the countryside. Fortunately, the Lombards were successfully deposited north of the Alps, which is where they remained until the end of the reign of Justinian. In a showdown between the Goths and Romans, Tias, who commanded the Ostrogoths, had to fight Narses. The Battle of Mons Lactarius, which the close combat lasted for over 2 days, ended in a Gothic defeat, Tias having fought to his last breath. The Ostrogoths, after the Battle of Mons Lactarius, were totally beaten. In 553, the Franks and Alemanni invaded Italy. Narses annihilated the Frankish army at the Battle of Capua in 554, and then pursued a campaign to retake the towns the Franks and resistant Ostrogoths still held. By 555, all Italy south of the Po was reconquered once again. By 562, Verona and Brixia was also recovered. A prefecture of Italy and Sicily was established to govern the new provinces. With Italy firmly in Roman hands, the Corpus Juris Civilis replaced the Ostrogothic code of laws. All grants of Ostrogothic kings up to Theodahad were recognised as legitimate, but those of Totila were annulled. He was condemned as a tyrant, thus making all of his acts illegitimate. Property was restored to their former owners. The special funds for repairs of public buildings, aqueducts, the dredging of the Tiber, and the Roman grain dole were all reaffirmed. Provincial governors were also to be elected by local magnates and bishops rather than appointees by the emperor. Taxes were reduced as much as they were reasonably possible. Narses, the final conqueror of Italy, was made praetor of Italy for the next 13 years. Ravenna was the capital of the province and remained so until its loss in 557. In 751. Ravenna was the capital of the province and remained so until its loss in 751. And now, finally, on to Spain. Though it is known whether Justinian intended to conquer Spain from the beginning of his reign, or simply as a result of his achievement of Italy off Africa, is unknown. With more certainty, it can be said that he had defeated Vitiges, resulted in that after he had defeated Vitiges, he wanted the capitulation of Italy by 549. What is more certain is that after he had achieved the capitulation of Vitiges, Justinian's next target of conquest was most definitely Spain, and would have more than likely attacked Spain had Belisarius followed his orders. Nevertheless, southern Spain had only a tenuous link to the Visigoths themselves, and when Aguila tried to impose stricter control over the province, Cordoba rebelled and defeated King Aguila's army. This led to the usurpation of Athanagild. The Visigoths were a threat to the province of Africa. In 546, they had crossed the straits and tried to take Septum from the Romans. A conquest of southern Spain would create a buffer zone between the Visigoths and Africa. Perhaps Justinian's more immediate motivations for attacking Spain was that he was personally invited to intercede in Spanish affairs by the royal rivals, either Aguila or Athanagild. Justinian, not one to give up an opportunity, gave his support. Although to which king is unclear. Was it Aguila or Athanagild? As in his previous conquests, he had come in against a usurper, and it is likely that Jordanes is correct that Aguila summoned the Romans, rather than Athanagild. See Jordanes, Gettiger, chapter 58, part 303. Although Isidore of Seville, who wrote about 60 years later, said that Athanagild had summoned them instead. See Isidore, History of the Kings of the Goths, 46-47. However, as Athanagild was winning the war, it seems likely that Aguila would need outside aid more urgently. Whatever the excuse, it was an opportunity that Justinian exploited. The Ostrogothic kingdom was rocked by instability at this point. With the death of its incompetent and cruel king Amalaric, Thugis, the former regent of Amalaric, took the throne, and in 548 died after a peaceful rule. Theudigarcelus followed on but was assassinated in 549. King Aguila tried to take the throne back for the former Visigothic dynasty, but civil war erupted between him and Athanagild. Aguila asked Justinian for help. Justinian sent a fleet to Spain, commanded by Liberius the Patrician, who had some experience in protecting Sicily from Totila for a short time. In 550, Liberius sailed from Sicily to Panormus, after Artabanes relieved him from the war with Totila. Liberius in 552 sailed on to southern Spain with his expeditionary force. His small force achieved great success and captured many coastal towns and forts with Aguila and Athanagild, while Aguila and Athanagild fought each other. Supposedly, Liberius took these towns for Athanagild. Athanagild, in 554, after he had defeated Aguila, tried to throw the Romans back into the sea, but met with failure. The area Liberius conquered was secure enough for the Romans to establish a province. The security of this province seems to have lain partly in the favourable support of the Hispano-Romano population. This province included Gibraltar, Malaga, Sargontia, Carthago-Nova, and Asonia. It possibly also included Cordoba. This province of Hispania did not include western Mauritania as it had done in the past. This was governed by the Prefecture of Africa. A master of soldiers was placed in charge of Hispania. Clearly, the military nature of this province is laid evident. Despite the success of Liberius and the security of this province had, Procopius barely mentions it, instead talking mostly about his war, Justinian's war in Italy. And so, there we have it. By the end of his reign, Justinian had managed to conquer Africa, southern Spain, Sicily, and Italy. And now, having discussed the motivations, conduct, and a little bit about the settlement of all three of these provinces, I shall now delve into the legacies of these reconquests. The initial war with Africa was not without its opponents. The Persian War had just come to an end, and the Romans were naturally pensive at sending an expedition to Africa. Not only was the memory of Leo the Great's colossal failure a deterrent, but as Procopius records, John the Cappadocian was firmly against it. John was Justinian's praetorian prefect, and thus head of the administration and one of Justinian's lieutenants. He pointed out that communications would be difficult. Messages sent to Africa would take about 140 days by land and the same number on the return journey. They could take the shorter journey by sea, but risk never returning at all. John pointed out that Africa could not be taken without also conquering Sicily and Italy. Failure would result in retribution by the Vandals, possibly in the form of piracy, as they did in the 5th century. John's caution was so persuasive that Justinian nearly listened to it, had it not been for the intervention of a bishop from the east, who called on Justinian to protect the Homoousian Christians of Africa. See Procopius, The Vandalic War, Book 3, Chapter 10, lines 1 to 21. Immediately, it would seem that the conduct of the wars, the resources spent on these provinces, and the tidal nature of the victories and defeats of the Romans in these theatres were certainly mixed. They stretched the borders the empire had to defend into the deserts of Africa, the hills of southern Spain, and along the Po in Italy, and further extending the Balkan frontier to include Dalmatia. However, it should be remembered that Justinian's initial expeditionary force was quite small, far smaller than that of Leo's, nearly a tenth of the size. This shows a low-risk commitment on Justinian's part. In Italy, he wanted to bring peace to Italy as soon as it became viable. It was the pride of Belisarius who was responsible for getting bogged down in years of fighting for the sake of retaking Vita. However, to assess the conquest of Justinian and to pronounce on their success, and even was it wise for him to do so, it must be remembered that this was a process of 38 years, and many things changed. The world of 565 was quite different to that of 333, when his ambitions were first put into action. After Justinian died, new enemies appeared. In Italy, the Lombards invaded from the north. in 568. Along the Danube, the Avars and Slavs posed a considerable threat. Even so, the Romans managed to hold on to each of Justinian's conquests for a considerable amount of time. The Romans maintained a presence in Italy until 1071 with the fall of Bari, and they held Sicily for some 300 years. Spain, the conquest with the least amount of effort employed, but perhaps meeting with the most success and fewest risks, was a Roman province for 70 years, and proved a buffer for West Africa against the Visigoths. Africa provided a base for the Romans as much as Anatolia did. It remained in Roman hands until 698. Even then, had the Carabisiani succeeded in retaking Carthage and the rest of the province, it may well have been part of the Eastern Roman Empire for far longer. The Dalmatian coasts managed to stay within the Byzantine sphere even into the reign of Alexios I, in one form or another. It is difficult, therefore, to say that these conquests were short-lived, when some of them outlasted the existence of some empires. However, it is also notable that all of these reconquests were war zones, and because the gaps between peace and war were never long enough for the seeds of prosperity to take root, the empire was never truly able to extensively benefit from these conquests. In addition, Justin II's rash choice to attack Persia rather than try and achieve total victory in one of their new provinces meant that the empire's resources stretched too thin. As a result, the north, and then eventually heartland of Italy, was lost to the Lombards without any more supplies and troops coming from the east. The east drained the empire's resources so much that troops from the armies of Illyricum and Thrace were denuded to bolster the armies of Armenia and the east. Tiberius II also recruited a new sub-command of federates, which he sent to the east to bolster the frontiers. This gives us an idea of how desperate the wars in the east were after the death of Justinian. As a result, the Illyrians and Thracians were unable to check the Slavs who invaded the Balkans, reaching as far as Athens and settling there. And yet, through the tireless efforts of Maurice, the status quo of sorts was managed across the empire. Had he not made the shockingly bad decision to winter on the north side of the Danube, rather than return to friendly territory, largely to save money, may have seen the empire emerge from this period of constant warfare far more intact than it was under the reign of terror of Phocas. It should also be remembered that Justinian did not devote a majority of the resources at his disposal on the west. The majority of the field armies were still deployed in the east and the Balkans and maintained a defensive posture. The sack of Antioch by Khosrow I was more a result of the Persian King of Kings' own military skill and the terribly poor morale the Roman troops had as a result of Justinian not paying. This he had done to save money. The plague in 542 wiped out a fifth of the population. The plague not only cut the empire's manpower, but also massively reduced its tax base and productivity, leading to dire economic depression. It is this economic depression and the frequency of wars, even after Justinian's death, that explains why the empire struggled to pay the army, which Anastasius I had had no issue in accomplishing. Evagrius gives us a brief but poignant example of how the plague affected everyday people. Evagrius, Ecclesiastical History, Book 4, Chapter 29. I will also describe the circumstances of the pestilence which commenced at that time, and has now prevailed and extended over the whole world for 52 years. A circumstance such as has never before been recorded. 2 years after the capture of Antioch by the Persians, a pestilence broke out in some respects similar to that described by Thucydides, in others widely different. It took its rise from Ethiopia, as is now reported, but made a circuit of the whole world in succession, leaving, as I suppose, no part of the human race unvisited by the disease. Thus it happened in my own case, for I deem it fitting, in due adaptation of circumstances, to insert also in this history matters relating to myself, that at the commencement of this calamity I was seized with what were termed buboes, while still a schoolboy, and lost, by its recurrence at different times, several of my children, my wife, and many of my kin, as well as my domestic and country servants, the several indications making, as it were, a distribution of my misfortunes. Thus, not quite 2 years before my writing this, being now in the 58th year of my age, on its 4th visit to Antioch, at the expiration of the 4th indication from its commencement, I lost a daughter and her son, besides those who had died previously. The succession, totally unplanned by Justinian, was seized by Justin II, the son of Vigilantia. J.S.S. Evans asks whether the other Justin, the son of Germanus, could have done any better than the stormy reign of Justin II. He heavily blames the prejudices of the Empress Theodora against Germanus. Her legacy was so strong on Justinian that even 17 years after his wife's death, he still officially could not bring himself to appoint his more able nephew emperor. See Evans, The Age of Justinian, page 269. In conclusion, the removal of the barbarian threats to the west, especially the Vandals, removed the empire's main western enemies from the 5th century. Justinian was able to do this because of an adroit exploitation of opportunities as they presented themselves. It is a credit to the man he employed to achieve these conquests, such as Belisarius, Narses and Liberius, that what they accomplished had such long-lasting effects on the empire. Despite the many trials, blunders, natural disasters, infighting, and tribulations of these campaigns, as well as the exacting toll they had on the empire after they were reconquered, the empire's resilience, even with wars on 5 fronts, shows that this was not a wasted legacy. However, the retrenchment and attainment of a status quo under Maurice, who succeeded in stabilizing the dynasty with his son Theodosius, sorry, my streaming software disconnected twice. I'll restart from the top. In conclusion, the removal of the barbarian threats to the west, especially the Vandals, removed the empire's main western enemies from the 5th century. Justinian was able to do this because of an adroit exploitation of opportunities as they presented themselves. It is a credit to the men he employed to achieve these conquests, such as Belisarius, Narses and Liberius, that what they accomplished had such long-lasting effects on the empire. Despite the many trials, blunders, natural disasters, infighting and tribulations of these campaigns, as well as the exacting toll they took on the empire after they were reconquered, the empire's resilience, even with wars on 5 fronts, shows that this was not a wasted legacy. The over-ambition of Justin II and overspending of Tiberius II resulted in preventable disasters. However, the retrenchment and attainment of a status quo under Maurice, who succeeded in stabilizing the dynasty with his son Theodosius, indicates that had it not been for the tyranny of focus, the reconquests of Justinian may have left the empire even stronger in the 7th century. Even with focus, Africa, Italy, Sicily, and to a smaller extent Spain, left the empire with a greater chance of survival during the Persian and subsequent Islamic invasions in the 7th century. Therefore, I believe that Justinian's reconquests were a success and had an enduring legacy. I have now come to the end of my video. I would like to thank everyone who's watching this live and all of those of you who will watch it in the future. Thank you so much. I couldn't make this channel without you. You're all grand. I would like also to give, at this opportunity, to give a mention to Ottoman History Hub. He graciously watched and subscribed to my channel, and I feel it appropriate to return the favour. He covers Ottoman history, which for late Byzantine history is important to learn, and has certainly given me some useful pointers about it. I will and have put a link in the description to his channel. I hope you all enjoyed this talk about the Emperor Justinian the Great. I hope I did a fairly decent job of explaining why and what I think about his reconquests in a understandable manner. Have a very Merry Christmas, everyone, a Happy New Year, and as always, I have been your host, Daniel Maynard, and this has been Eastern Roman History.